Still gonna turn your
Okay.
volume down a little bit. Okay, let's get this going. Okay, I think we're alive. Let me look. Yep, we're on. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm sorry I had to.
You really went there, didn't you?
I did. Uh, this is our January Ukraine discussion, and because this has been the topic on everyone's mind and on everyone's lips for, well, pretty much the entire month, we're going to talk a little bit about the current controversy with Germany and Poland and their Leopard 2 tanks. And apparently, we need to talk about what a tank is and is not, too, because that has been some confusion. So I'm Daedalus, and this is Hetman, and we're going to take it away. But first, Hetman, have you heard anything from your friends and acquaintances inside Ukraine that you think bears mentioning?
No. There's talk about that Russia has started taking some villages. At least they had said that their own foreign ministry, I believe, said that they had taken a few villages in the Zaporizhia region. But now that has been confirmed to be true, that they actually have started to do limited offensive operations there. So that's not good. They realize that that access, that Ukraine has been talking about that access, and it's a particularly uh, strategically valuable point for them, because if the Ukrainians are able to advance far within to the Zaporizhia axis, they can cut off forces in the right bank, so the Kherson region, and then also Crimea. So from my friends, though, not a lot of note. I've been trying not to bother them so much because they're busy fighting, but um, yeah, as of now, I haven't heard of anything significant. Um,
Well, let's spend a couple seconds on that, actually, maybe a few minutes. So the
sure.
fighting is my understanding has been around Bakhmut, and there is a village's name that was captured north
Solidar,
of Bakhmut.
Solidar,
Yes, that
yeah,
I will not
Solidar.
even try to pronounce. Um, it's been a weird kind of campaign in my eyes because Russia's expended a abnormal amount of personnel and equipment to try to capture these villages.
It's not even so much Russian regular forces as it is the Wagner private military contracting group. And of course, they are an arm sort of the Russian military. They're sort of like I don't even know if I know like a real world equivalent of what they are, because most other PMCs that I know about, like Blackwater, uh, Executive Outcomes, I think is one of them. It's a South African group. They're not like Wagner. So they don't act in the interest of a state. And I'm pretty sure that the money that the Wagner group makes is all goes, all goes within,
Into
you
Russia,
know,
the Russian
into
army.
Russia. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, even so, like viewing the Wagner Group as part of Russia, I don't think is necessary, or the Russian army is necessarily uh, wrong. I think it's better to view it as a branch in the same way that the VDV is separate from the regular Russian military. Um,
I would agree with that assessment. I think it's a way. I mean, it's very blatant in Ukraine, their activities, but it's sort of a way for Russia to mask its dirty, sort of black missions abroad. And they have quite a history that they've racked up over the last decade, especially in Syria, but also in Africa as well. I think that they were in the Central African Republic. Um, Wagner. So the interesting thing is they've been losing a lot of personnel, but the human waves, quote unquote, that people have been talking about haven't really been what you traditionally think is a human wave. They've been waves of sort of squads or platoons at best. And after expending a few of them, one manages to break through. And I think some are even being used to draw artillery fire. So it's really, it's a wasteful use of troops, but they have been effective. They are incrementally gaining territory. And the issue is too is that their main goal isn't even so much grabbing this territory strategically, but it's actually to bleed the Ukrainian military white. And that's something that that's part of their strategy. There's also a rivalry between the Wagner group and the standard Russian military. Yevgeny Prigozhin is sort of vying for political leadership. Like he wants to eventually, I think, become the next president of Russia after Putin, which would be very horrifying to me. I don't know too much about him in terms of like his ideology, but you can see how evil of a man he is by just even how he conducts the campaign. And allegedly, their use of the punishments that they have been using. So, like for example, sentencing, like executing soldiers that are not, advancing. I guess that is true, at least according to someone who defected from it. But I mean,
Yes, I was reading
we
some of
don't
those
really know
reports.
how reliable it is.
Yeah, I'm not entirely certain I want to attach too much weight to what's his face that went to Norway to defect yet.
Yeah, I don't either. I wouldn't. You'd have to take what he says with a grain of salt for sure.
Uh,
Go ahead.
but like the area itself is strategic for Ukraine. I don't necessarily think the loss of the town of Bakhmut and the surrounding areas is as big a problem. For Ukraine, they're just basically holding the line and killing Russians. It's kind of working out in their favor.
That's what I think to some degree too. The issue is though is they are also taking significant casualties. So it's not like they are not feeling the assault, the effects of Russia's campaign,
Well, no.
um, and it will have an impact on them. I don't know how great it will be, but you're right. In terms of the territory, it's not. Some have argued because it sits, on a major supply line that it is very valuable. But to me, I don't think it has a lot of strategic value. Um, but in terms of attritionally, the way that they're waging this campaign, it's hurting them, but it's also hurting Ukraine. And the main thing is, in the long term, Russia has a they have a manpower advantage. They also have, so long as the West, keeps stalling like they're doing, Russia also has an advantage, in terms of their equipment. They're producing tanks.
Well, that
How
is
long they can do that is
probably as good a
anybody's
place
guess.
as any
But
to turn to the recent controversy.
over
Uh,
the Leopard 2s, yeah, and the
so
main battle tanks, Western main battle tanks.
to start, uh, the United States has donated a large number of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Stryker, uh, I guess the best word is hybrid APC infantry fighting vehicles. They have not at this time donated any tanks. France donated a couple wheeled tanks, like 10 or 12, I think, which are dubious quality. England is donating some Challenger 2s, I hear. But the big thing is there are a very large number of German designed Leopard 2s in European inventories that European countries want to send to Ukraine. They cannot until they get permission from Germany to modify the end user licenses. Germany, or more specifically at this point, it appears Chancellor Stolz is dragging his feet on this issue.
I wouldn't place the blame all on Schultz, honestly. There's fundamental opposition within German parliament to it. I mean, there's a sizable amount of people who are against it. And last I heard, I cannot give you the source, but even, like public support for the war has waned a little bit in Germany. In general, though, today, forget who. It's tough when you're working, but I forget who. I think it might have been Baerbock or one of the maybe the new Minister of Defense or Foreign Minister said that well, it's Baerbock, Foreign Minister, but they said essentially that they wouldn't stop Poland if they were to send a dozen uh, Leopard 2 tanks. So that's sort of a signal that they're giving the go ahead, I guess. But
That sounds to me like the German cabinet is divided on the issue. Because I seen the defense
yeah,
minister, the new defense minister came out in favor of it, and the foreign minister did. It's not strictly speaking their final call, though. Um, so I guess first thing we should talk about is why are tanks important? Um, the short answer is tanks are the leading offensive edge for most militaries. So a tank is important to Ukraine because it lets them take territory back more easily. Um, the second thing I'd point out is that the armored vehicles, not all armored vehicles are tanks. In fact, most are not tanks.
so here we're addressing, I think, the when France, the whole debate, the whole like issue of this sending, armored vehicles and tanks to Ukraine. I mean, the talk of it has been around for even early into this war. Ukraine was requesting Leopard 2s. But recently, I think France agreed to send, I forget the name of the APC, um, kind of a light, I think it's an AMX.
Yeah,
One of
its status as a tank is a little weird. Its armor profile is
It doesn't
lighter,
have tracks though, and it has light armor, and I think
but it has
if
a
I'm
big
not
cannon
mistaken,
for a light vehicle.
yeah, it has a 100 millimeter gun, as far
Yes.
as I know. Yeah, which is a big gun for an APC.
So, like, uh, the Leopard 2 is a tank that was designed in West Germany in the 1970s. It is widely regarded to be the second best main battle tank in the world.
What
It's
is regarded to be the best, though? Because I mean, there's a lot of people that would debate it. Some people say, for
If they don't say
example,
it's the
the
M1 Abrams, they're
M1A2.
wrong.
I would say the Challenger is the best one.
I think the Challenger is a wonderful tea kettle, but you can send a tea kettle to Ukraine much cheaper.
What do you mean by tea kettle, though?
It has a station for brewing tea inside the tank. That's what I mean.
Really?
Yes, it's been a feature of British tanks for a very long time.
That I did not know. I
Uh,
thought you actually somehow were alluding to like it blowing its top off,
no,
which
no, I'm just saying
actually
it's a
out
tea
of
kettle.
all the MBTs that we're mentioning here, the Challenger 2 tank is the only one I believe that has not been knocked out in combat. Um, Export variant M1A1s, M1A2s have been knocked out in Yemen, for example. Um, the Leopard 2 did very poorly in Turkish hands. I think it was 2016 in northern Syria against ISIS. I don't know how many were destroyed. It was something like maybe 5 Leopards in one engagement, and some of them had their turrets completely blown off. It was very obvious that they had a cook-off, which supposedly
That
that
speaks.
variant of a Leopard is designed to, the way that their ammunition is separate from, the crew compartment. It I don't know how it had an ammo cook-off.
That
I
speaks
do
more
know
to
that there were
Turkish
not.
incompetence than it does to tank design problems.
Oh, no, it 100% speaks about Turkish incompetence. The issue is, though, that modern Russian anti-tank weapons can knock out the Leopard 2 and have
Absolutely,
knocked out the
it's not a
Leopard 2.
question of tanks being invincible. It's a question of what kind of ancillary systems are on the tank. So, like you take a
Yes,
Russian tank like the T-72, T-80, T-90s, they all use auto-loading systems, which reduces the number of crew, but you
yeah,
have ammo arranged in a concentric ring underneath the turret. So you
Mhm.
get cases when they take hits that the ammo cooks off and explodes and the turret pops off. That's where the Russian turret popping syndrome comes from. American tanks use a very advanced
The
auto-loading system called the 19-year-old boy, throwing shells in, and German tanks do too. Um, and they have,
I actually thought that some variants of the Leopard 2 have autoloader,
they
if I'm
might,
not mistaken. They
but
have an autoloader, but it's the ammunition compartment is separate from
yes,
the
they have
crew
separate
area.
ammo stored. So you
Yeah,
theoretically, if you're practicing good ammo discipline, you're not in a situation where you get ammo cook-offs by taking hits to that
yeah.
compartment. So
So in the case, if you don't mind me interjecting, in the case of the Turkish Leopard 2s, and there were Leopard 2 A4s, just to let you know. So likely, this is an earlier model, and likely these would be the models that Ukraine would be getting. They're still very, very good tanks. They're better than probably everything Russia has, with the exception of the T-90M or the Armata tank. But even so, we're dealing with an older variant of the Leopard 2. They're not getting the Leopard 2s, for example, with the passive countermeasure system or the active countermeasure system, which would be more effective. So we should explain what those are, by the way, passive and active counter measures. Should I explain, or do you want to take it up?
go ahead.
So passive, as far as I know, I'm not an expert on tanks, but passive countermeasure systems on tanks are devices that are used to jam uh, laser guided systems, anti-tank systems, most of them, or the electronic systems of an enemy. Active countermeasures are essentially like hard kill systems. So what they do is if a RPG round, say an RPG round or a ATGM gets within range of the tank, um, it's kind of like a claymore, as far as I understand. Some of the active countermeasure systems, at least I think that's how the
It
Israeli one, the trophy, works.
it employs
Um,
projectiles to shoot down incoming rounds.
yeah, so
So
these are yeah, they're very useful for modern, tank warfare, especially with such proliferation of ATGMs and
I
particularly effective ones.
do not necessarily think that the problem here is the tank itself. So the
Yeah,
tank works as a part of a combined arms unit. So you have tanks, like maybe 5 or 6 tanks, and around them you focus these strikers or Bradleys that the United States is giving. And these strikers or Bradleys contain infantry, so they can move out or punch out around the side, and then you have infantry deployed to take out threats to the tanks before they can threaten the tank. Uh, and that kind of comes down to how you employ your infantry. And the
it's an
biggest,
issue though, is teaching, people. Ukrainian tankers are good. A lot of them are some of your older, veterans of either the ATO, for example, the anti-terrorist operation. So, the war in Donbass before the current war. And even some of them are retired Soviet tankers. So they do have, some capable people there. The issue is, though, is that Ukraine hasn't. I mean, they did employ their tanks in an offensive way during the Kharkiv offensive, but they're not the most effective at employing their tanks.
no, they have to be trained.
That's
But
the thing. Training them is going to take even like a flash course training in this sort of combined arms maneuver would take something like 4 months, as far as I know, right?
depends on how you're doing it. There are a couple points though to make about that. A number of European countries are providing training havens for Ukraine where they can train troops, and they've been taking great effect to that. If they get these Bradleys, which they will, and if they happen to get a sufficient number of tanks, they can train people in these things and be able to employ these for summer or late fall offensives. So I don't think that the current deficiency is not really the case. The problem, the current deficiency is something that can be overcome. And you also have a case where because Ukraine right now has these safe havens, these bases, and is still getting supplies, their deficiencies are going to lessen over time, but Russia's are getting worse. Like Russia has had serious problems doing these combined armed operations with tanks and infantry and IFVs. And that's supposed to be the hallmark of Russian warfare, and they're just not doing it properly. They're going to get better over time, but they've expended an obscene amount of equipment. And I don't think
It's not even just the equipment losses with Russia, it's a lot more experienced soldiers. It's the attrition on people who have, you know, knowledge of how to conduct such operations, and they've lost a lot of them. They lost some of, like, with the VDV, they lost some of their best, soldiers even at the very beginning of this campaign. So yeah, that's an even graver threat to Russia than the loss of equipment. They have plenty of equipment to continue. They're producing more equipment.
I don't
They have a
think they're
lot of
producing
natural
enough equipment.
resources to do so.
I don't think they're
Probably
producing
not.
enough equipment, and I don't think they have nearly as much equipment as I claim they did. You
That could be true.
because
Yeah,
you
that
look
could
at
be
it,
true.
there are a couple
It
things I
remains to be
think
seen, though. Go ahead.
it doesn't. I think we're there. Uh, Russia, for example, used to have the Tank Olympics, right?
Yeah.
And the consistent winner of the Tank Olympics was a T-72. Obviously, this was a staged event. Like Tank Olympics are stupid and silly. But the idea was that they convinced other countries to buy T-72s. Russia very quickly last year, much more quickly than you would have expected, started breaking out modernized T-62s too, which suggests to me that their T-72 supplies are not nearly adequate enough to re-equip their destroyed units because they're putting these
Just to let some of
T-62s.
the viewers
Stop.
know that. Oh, sorry.
Let me finish. They're You're getting to the point where these T-62s are being put in frontline units. These are old tanks. Um, they're not the same equivalent as the T-90s. They're not building enough T-90s. They won't even commit their T-14s because they're afraid of losing them. I don't think Russia's equipment situation is nearly as robust as they claim it is, or at least evidence thus far suggests it's not.
If you can explain to our viewers, because I'm sure some of them, we've talked about tanks before on this channel, but not, we're not devoting a specific episode to it. Explain to them the significance of the T-72, what the T-72 is, and why it's important to the Russian army. It's essentially the workhorse tank in the Russian army, and even the T-90 is essentially an upgraded T-72. The first tank that they've released that's sort of a departure from uh, this type of design is the Armada, actually, and they are afraid to lose them. They don't have that many of them. I think you can count them in the dozens, maybe 20 or 30 tanks total.
I
So
don't
they've
think it's much
been,
more than 14 or 15.
yeah, yeah, even less probably than what I said. So um, you're not going to see them in combat probably at all in this war.
No.
I've seen quite a few videos lately of T90s being destroyed, like T90Ms, their best ones. And a lot of the ways that they've been destroying them is through, precise artillery hits with Excalibur rounds.
So let's just do a short history of tanks in general,
Yeah,
because that's fun,
of
sort of.
course.
The tank comes around in World War One. You have static trench warfare in the West, and everyone's trying to figure out some way of breaking this stalemate. So, England and the United Kingdom in particular gets on the idea of a big armored vehicle full of machine guns to drive across the no man's land of the trench and take territory. They try a couple times to introduce this. Once at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, they send about 30 or so tanks across. They're not in sufficient numbers to break the lines and advance far. They try again at an area called Ypres or Flanders Fields, which is famous for being muddy, wet hellhole, and that completely fails because the tanks just get stuck in the mud. In 1917, the first mass use of tanks happens at the Battle of Cambrai, and something like 400 British tanks roll across the field, scatter the Germans, and they start running away. However, and sources vary on why this happened, the infantry didn't follow up to exploit the breach. So the tanks reached their endpoint, realized they were all by themselves, turned around and came home. World War One ends, and you got some tank development, and people are trying to figure out what to do about the tank. And a whole bunch of tank designs come out of several countries in the interwar period between World War One and World War Two. And World War Two happens, and tanks are very famously involved in Germany's uh, conquest of countries, for example. But the long and the short of it is, you kind of start to get this golden age of tank designs in World War Two. And you get three basic ideas of a tank. You get a light tank that's small, fast, lightly armored, and armed to exploit breakthroughs. You get a medium tank, which is kind of the same idea, but it's better armored and better armed. And then you start to get concepts like the heavy tank. Most of the tanks built in World War II that were used in widespread usage were medium tanks. So a lot of these things are the famous American M4 Shermans, which was used by basically every Allied country because we built a lot of them, and they got to be very good tanks near the end of the war. And you have things like the Panzer IV, um, or the Soviet T-34. These are medium tanks, decent firepower, decent protection, etc. You also get examples of some much heavier tanks. Arguably the German Panther, which is classified as a medium tank, but still significantly heavier than, almost as heavy as a modern American tank today. Or the especially famous examples of the Tiger 1 and 2 tanks. After the war is where things get a little bit interesting. You see two kind of divergent sets of development for tanks. American tanks gradually add bells and whistles like sights and better equipment, and they start to get heavier and heavier. Soviet tanks, particularly the T-60, the T series, stay very much medium tanks in design. So, like, the biggest difference today between the Leopard 2 and the Abrams and their Soviet counterparts is that the Leopard 2 and the Abrams weigh in at about 20 tons heavier, and they tend to have these more advanced protection systems, and they require more training and more crew members. And the Soviet T tanks are designed around this concept of a conscript army. You got 3 crew, you don't really have to train much in loading. They're lighter, they're smaller, significantly smaller. Um, they're just smaller tanks. The T-14, which is Russia's newest tank, is getting up there. It's maybe 50 tons. Um, it has more crew. It has an internal toilet, for example, which is a godsend to any tanker anywhere. So, like, there's this different evolution in tank design in two different directions they go in. So you get these American or German tanks, which have a lot of bells and whistles. And no tank is invincible. Like you said, artillery will tank out a tank. A 155 millimeter shell is going to mess up your day really good, no matter what you're in. Uh, yes, Cal, they are cheaper to a certain extent. However, you have to build a lot more of them, so whether they're not cheaper or not is dependent.
You have in mind when you say that the Russian T series, right?
Yes, the Russian T series is the cheaper set of tanks.
And as far as I know, actually, the Leopard 2 out of NATO tanks is the most economical in terms of its design. And that's why you see so many of the NATO countries operating Leopard 2s, specifically the lowland countries, so like Netherlands, Belgium. Um, what's interesting is not a lot is mentioned about France's Leclerc tank. Leclerc, I think it's called.
The clerk.
Yeah, Italy has its own main battle tank that has a strongly resembles, at least to me, like a Challenger or an Abrams tank. And then, of course, there's the Israeli Merkava. tanks, which are interesting. They kind of serve as both APC and tank. Um, Everybody claims that their tank is the best in the world. And as far as Ukraine, so the logistics in terms of training them is there. Some people that I know have argued that in terms of replacement parts and things like this, that we would have to build a system in Ukraine, a logistics system, in order for them to, be operated on properly. I mean, because that's the thing, and that was why a lot of countries were opting to send Ukraine Czech and Polish modified T-72s, which have the reverse speed. I think they have a faster reverse speed. That's one of the main problems, by the way, with the T series and specifically the T-72. Um, but this was the reason why, a lot of people have found it more useful. I mean, came to that idea to give them more T-72s because they have that infrastructure to repair the tanks and they have replacement parts for them.
Well,
Um,
logistics is always going to be an issue, especially as
it
you're
is, yeah. I'm
seeing a
sure
changeover.
though, yeah, yeah. The issue though that I'm seeing, and we'll only know this when it happens. So as long as it's being stalled, we're not going to actually know the effect of it. But I am skeptical that Leopard 2s will be the game changer in this war. And I don't think I'm actually really hesitant to talk about any weapon systems in that way, as being game changers in this current conflict. Like some people are saying, if Ukraine gets a batch of F-16s, it'll be a game changer. Um, I mean, Russia has plenty of planes that can out dogfight an F-16,
So
even modern variants.
that is a separate discussion about planes. That is probably
It's a
something,
completely separate. It's beyond the scope of this video.
yeah.
But what I'm saying is the point I'm trying to make is that it remains to be seen whether or not this is going to be the game changer. That this, get them getting 300. So that's the ideal amount. That's what Valery Zaluzhny said would be the amount of tanks he would need to win this war. He actually, by the way, did not specify what winning would mean. So he has never said, for example, going all the way to the Kerch Strait or retaking Crimea. That's been mostly politicians. But what I think he has in mind is actually, you know, pushing back the Russian forces or destroying as many of them to have a negotiations be on, a stronger footing in negotiations.
Well, what winning means is also a different thing. But talking about tanks in particular and whether or not the tanks are game changer, I don't think so. What they are is a handful of them offers an offensive force for Ukraine that they can take territory back with. Uh, the idea is not so much what territory we take back, but what options Ukraine develops. The game changing weapons, and Estonia today, for example, is giving Ukraine all of their field artillery pieces, every last one of them. That I think is going to make a bigger difference in the end.
I
Because
would agree with you there.
our
I would second
artillery
that.
is very much a force multiplier for weapons. For infantry, anyway, it lets small numbers of infantry take on significantly larger forces. And because Russia has this manpower advantage, having artillery available is essential for Ukraine in defense or offense. The tanks in particular, though, give Ukraine options. Like right now, they have to do they like when they did the surprise offensive in Kharkiv, they made extensive use of thunder runs to take back territory, which worked out very well because the Russians were not expecting it to happen. Um, I don't necessarily know,
Okay.
I don't necessarily know if that's a strategy you can continue to rely on, though. Like you need some kind of armored force that can take a fight to an enemy, and a armored brigade style system like the West has lets them do that. So that's really what the tank is about. I don't think it's a I need X number of tanks and we can win the war. I think it is being able to change up the situation on the Russians so that the Russians have to start learning all over again.
And thus far, honestly, tank on tank battles have been very limited in this war.
Well, that's to be expected too. The other thing to keep in mind is the dramatic quality change between Russia's force when they started and their forces now. They're going to have a much harder time dealing with combined arms for the Russian army than they would have had at the start of the war because their best units are destroyed. They're reconstituting units. Uh, they do not have the necessary skills to be able to absorb losses and get better at the same time right now. There's kind of a window of opportunity there.
There is the issue, though, is that applies to Ukraine as well. It applies to, you know, the attrition that you know affects their army as well. So that's also a problem. And you know, as I said before, it's going to take a while to get them trained on these things. Um, I think, though, having said this, I do believe, however, that Ukraine does have inherently an advantage in terms of you know its units being of better quality. Um, what's very interesting is I have a friend, and I didn't want to bother him, my buddy Kostya. He is actually a commander of a T-64. I should have sent him some questions prior to this video, but I really, given the situation there, I really didn't want to bother him too much.
Yeah.
Got a lot on his plate. Um, but yeah, the thing about the Kharkiv offensive, though, is Ukraine, it did surprise the Russians because they weren't expecting it, but also, you know, in that particular sector, they were very, very, the defense was very, very poorly. Like they didn't have that many troops. I believe in some areas, Ukraine outnumbered the Russians something like 8 or even 12 to 1. So in a lot of the areas where, like for example, Zaporizhia, the Zaporizhia region, an offensive there, they've already built up, for example, lines of defense, sort of developing like a defense in depth strategy. There's also and this is something, we haven't really talked about a lot, and I don't think a lot of people are talking about. Um, there is the Russian Air Force. They still are very, very much intact. And actually, as far as attrition is concerned, they haven't they haven't been as present as they should, as they people were expecting, but they still have you know their air units very much intact, and that without a significant supply of anti-air systems, doing these counteroffensives is going to be very difficult for Ukraine. Right now, I think one strategy that the Russians have is to utilize the drones to attrit the SAM systems that are being given, the air defense systems. It The more systems that we get that are given to Ukraine, the more they can employ at the front, and the less that they will be using to protect their cities and their infrastructure. So basically, like now they have a choice whether to keep them at the front or to use them to guard cities. So that is a big part of all of this is air defense systems, and tanks are very vulnerable to aircraft if they're not supported with you know by air power or ground to air
So
systems.
the air war is again a huge thing, but there is a dynamic, and it was a report. That was the one you sent, and as
Yeah,
far as I can tell, the situation hasn't changed much. The actual situation for aircraft themselves is something of a stalemate. Ukraine can't attack the Russians, and the Russians, but they're still at the same time good at avoiding the Russians. So no one's really gaining anything in air operations. Um, it's going to attrit both forces, but it attrits the Ukrainian Air Force worse. The attacks on the cities are a separate thing. Um, there is some indication presently that attacks on infrastructure like power and water and heat and all those things has not worked. So Russia is opting now to simply attack residential areas. Um, the reason they're attacking the cities as opposed to units on the ground is the weapons that they have been employing, especially this loitering attack munition drones from Iran, are not terribly good at. They don't have big explosives. They're not good at
yeah,
attacking dispersed targets like a ground force. The missiles is a weird decision. I don't know why they're expending so many ballistic missiles on soft targets when they should be using it on military targets. It seems like it's a frustration attack to a certain extent, than rather than a concerted effort to try to break Ukraine. Like they're just trying to kill Ukrainians at this point. They're not using their weapons the best ways they can. And that's what a lot of this ultimately comes down to. Like you get into these discussions, and there's a very much a danger to get into the right hand insert of Wikipedia syndrome, where you're reading off stats of a vehicle and deciding these stats are superior to these stats, therefore they should win. A lot of it's going to come down to who is employing their tools better.
yeah, yeah.
And in least
Entirely.
in the
That's what
my
it is.
view, despite the suffering involved, Ukraine is doing a better job of employing their tools.
Yeah, yeah, I would second it.
Um,
Um, I, there's just so much uncertainty with how this war is going to progress. I, you know, am completely blind as to how the spring is going to look, how the summer is going to look, and fall, of course, next fall. Um, it's my opinion that in the short term or medium term, this could go on, as I think you and I have talked about, probably another year. Um, in the long term, I think it definitely favors Ukraine, especially if Western alliances, if the West maintains its cohesiveness and unity in terms of supplying Ukraine. The issue is, though, is I am not sure that Ukraine can meet the political objectives that they have set out. So, I mean, in terms of recapturing all of their territory, um, and there are a lot of other people that are, you know, that have uh, that same thought. Um, Even General Mark Milley, for example, has come out and said that he is not sure whether or not Ukraine will be able to retake its territory, especially in 2023. He said so. It's very unlikely that they will be able to do that. Um, then again, you know, we could be wrong. This they could have a breakthrough. Russian lines could collapse. Um, but what has kind of astounded me is actually the strength of Russia's will to fight in this, especially given the fact that your average Russian soldier from a place far away from, like, say, Bashkortostan or something, like, they don't have anything really invested in this. So, but they're fighting hard. They're fighting tenaciously.
well,
And
uh,
that's the thing that concerns me is there's no end in sight in terms of their will. And
Armies generally
how are you?
have will until they don't, is really what
Yeah,
happens. The book I would say to read to try to understand that is a set of accounts from World War II by a man named Glenn Gray called The Warriors. Um, I'm not particularly worried, or I'm not particularly concerned about that as a factor because armies have will until they don't. And in most cases, the collapse is very sudden and very
yep.
unexpected. For example, the Afghan National Army collapsed very suddenly in front of the Taliban. And cases where armies don't just collapse when they're losing a war are kind of rare. So the moment, like, there's no like, people try to say, yeah, I can see the signs on the wall, but they're usually full of it because it's very difficult to see when that moment is going to come. It's very easy to make the wrong estimation in those cases. Um, so I'm not as concerned about that. There is clearly an enormous amount of energy being expended in Russia to make sure that people do not know what's really going on so that they react in certain ways. Like the entire purpose of the Russian media apparatus is to get people to, yes, I am very boring, I'm sorry, is yes, to get people to go through and think about their situation in certain ways and to not acknowledge other aspects of things. And it's a very effective system. Um, so I'm not really concerned about that because what's going to happen is one day Russia will have an army and the next day it won't. That's really how fast it'll be. Um,
Getting back on that note, I think that we should have an episode in the future talking about Afghanistan, the specifically the fall of the ANA government and the collapse of their military, because that was such a, I mean, I think, how much faith did you have in them, all these years, even knowing people who trained them? I think you did know
I
people who
did
trained
quite a
them.
few of
I
people
know
who
a
trained
few.
them.
I know, yeah, I
I
know a
had
few
absolutely
people who did.
zero faith in them, but that's
Yeah,
I am not a good barometer because I talk to people who know what's going on in their own little spheres, and the stories they told me, I put together into a giant web of, oh my God, this is not great. So I'm not a good barometer for that
yeah.
because I was able to have frank and candid conversations that weren't necessarily being had elsewhere. Um,
In terms of Ukraine's army, I'm, I know of quite a few people in the Ukrainian army, and I have, let's just say it's nothing similar at all to what happened to the ANA. But what I can tell you is the level of corruption. There's a level of corruption still there, a strong one. I can also tell you too that they have themselves been very wasteful in terms of how expending equipment and human lives. My friend, who I will not mention even his first name, has told me this, who's in artillery. He's written about this. He has a blog, like a Telegram account. I will ask him for permission. Maybe even he'd be willing to,
Maybe we should
maybe
talk to him off
I
stream first.
translate some. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the plan. But I might be willing to talk with him. Here is something I didn't want to mention it, but this is something he wrote in his blog. Before my friend, so this friend of mine survived the siege of Chernihiv, and after surviving that, um, for a few months, he was looking for work, and he ultimately decided he wanted to defend. Throughout this whole time, he decided that he wanted to join the military, and he had no prior military experience, but for whatever reason, he tested and was put into artillery, and that's where he's at now. Um, and he just wrote recently where he said that before I went into the military, people were telling me, don't go. It's a wasted endeavor. It's very bad. And he, went and he said, now I am telling my own friends this who are eager to join the fight. So that says a lot about Ukraine as well. Ukraine suffers from many of the same Soviet era deficiencies that Russia does. A lot of people, when they, especially people like yourself who haven't visited the country, I don't think, and that's my problem. A lot of the people who are, analysts of Ukraine, who are, within Ukrainian studies, they have a very skewed view of what Ukraine is, and they actually, they've never looked at the country in a realistic light, and in terms of, and I'm not talking about real politic here, but what I'm saying is, um, a lot of what you're seeing on the media about the Ukrainian army, you have to take that with a big grain of salt because the situation can be very different on the ground. Um, a girl I know whose father was around Bakhmut was telling me that her father's unit was without like winter clothing, was without like various things that they needed. They're still relying on crowdfunding. Russia is too, to a degree, but you know the only side that matters to me in this conflict is Ukraine. Is Ukraine winning? And when I hear things like this, it's very discouraging. Um,
So
I
let me
think
tell
at
you,
the end of the day, go ahead.
let me tell you something. The sentences that you attributed to your friend in artillery are not dissimilar to sentences that you can attribute from American veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan now. And it's something you will find throughout history too.
Yeah,
We have a case where we see people who served in the military in a certain light that the military themselves does not necessarily always reflect. So all of the things that you're describing that Russia and Ukraine are doing that seem abnormal are not. Um, the United States Army, for example, had civilians providing body armor to troops prior to Iraq. It's not an uncommon thing. It's not what we intend or what we think should be happening. But that in and of itself, and I understand why you feel the way you do, but that in and of itself does not, with a little perspective, look necessarily any worse than anything else that has happened. So, like, it's not great what you're describing,
yeah, of course.
but it's not a death blow either. Like, it's not necessarily a reason to
No,
be depressed.
no, I would never say that it's a death blow. And actually, I might be sounding like an uber pessimist here, but I think what it's going to come down to is what army has more of these Soviet era deficiencies. And at the moment, it seems like, from what we see, it seems like Russia is the one that has the disadvantage. I also think, too, deficiencies aside, that, Ukraine has been innovative in ways in this conflict, you know, in ways that even than some of the modern NATO armies. I really believe that. I believe that they have, units of that quality. The issue is, though, is that these problems still are endemic, and they aren't, they're not going to go away um, overnight, and probably not even through this conflict.
No, and
Um,
they're going to stick around in all armies and all conflicts going forward.
yeah,
Like the one thing I will
yeah,
absolutely guarantee
mhm.
is that soldiers are always going to bitch. Absolutely
Yeah.
guarantee that.
I mean, that's a given. Um, I really, I'm gonna have to set up a conversation with several of my friends. I don't know if I can get them on this stream. I think it would be actually illegal for them to do
We are
that?
not going to put there's a set of rules the
Yeah,
United States military uses called operational security to determine what
yeah,
should be
OPSEC, yep.
said when and where. It's shortened to OPSEC. We are absolutely going to follow OPSEC here on this channel
Yeah.
with regards to any conflict, but this one in particular.
My
So if we're
question
going
to
to
you,
have a
yeah,
conversation, it'll be pre-recorded, and I will make sure to exclude anything that shouldn't be in there. That way we don't have a problem.
my question to you, going off of this and towards the end of this video, what do you think is the biggest deficiency now in the United States military, and the most troubling one? If you were to, like, to pick one, what do you think is something that could very, very much adversely affect us in the future?
So I've had a couple different conversations with a couple different people that give me some indications of things that need to be fixed. The problem the United States military is forced into right now is that it is a volunteer force which is not attracting volunteers.
Yeah,
So they're going to get into a point, you have a point to a certain extent, especially amongst enlisted, that they do a tour or two and they stop. They don't re-enlist. Officers, most of them don't get past their stage of being a captain. Uh, you're going to have a soon, in very short order, a skill gap in the lower ranks that you have to find a way to fill. And I don't know how much time. I mean, obviously, because I've been spending a lot of time administering this, I have been spending a lot more time looking into social media trends. I have noticed that National Guards and military units have been embracing the concept of TikToks and shorts and other things as a method to try to get people interested in to be recruited. They have to work to address this. The other thing they have to work to address is I think the new PT standards that the Army came up with were probably a bad idea. Um, they
well,
came out with a new PT test, and I swear to God, I haven't talked to a single person who thinks it was a good plan. I also talked to a number of people who pointed out that the concept of promoting a culture of physical fitness is somewhat countermanded if anyone can walk into a fast food restaurant on post and order food, fast food again. The approach is not holistic, and the test itself um, is intense. Those two things are cultural problems, though, that are very difficult to deal with. Uh, they're not necessarily quick fixes.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Especially going forward to what happens, because we are a volunteer military. What happens if we can't keep up that manpower? Or does conscription become
Oh, that's exactly the thing. Conscription is still a fairly common practice throughout most
the world? Yeah.
European armies. So that's what will happen. Absolutely. It will not be popular, though.
No, not at all. Not at all.
The U.S.
Um,
military has never used holistic training standards. Once in a while, I'll tell you the story about me ROTC and CrossFit and the disaster that was. That was for the chat. Uh, CrossFit was not a thing that I took to very well. Like, it's one thing to work out. It's entirely another to lead groups of people in workouts. It's entirely a third thing. However, we have hit our hour
yeah,
mark, and we should probably wrap it up because the dog's patience is waning. So as for what is going on, we will be doing the regular show episode sometime next weekend, date to be announced. I have to reschedule the abortion talk again, which is understandable because people have schedules that are weird when they work in health care for women. Uh, I am finishing a video essay, which should be out probably tomorrow because I'm not going to get it done tonight, I'm sure. It's probably 40 minutes long, and I've only recorded 8 minutes of dialogue. Other than that, thank you everyone for coming out, and have a good day.
sure.
All right, we're out.